So today we'd like to welcome special guests, Kerry McCormack, Councilman of Ward 3. In 2016, at the age of the youngest member of City Council. What he brought to that role was the neighborhood of Ohio, Vermont, downtown of Clark. Prior to that, he served as Director of Community Affairs for Ohio City, Inc. His voice is bold and brave, but his ear is trained to lead. The high school Look Up to Cleveland program, as well as a proud alum of Leadership Cleveland 2017. Blaine has described his ward and its neighborhoods as tenacious, caring, and bountiful. He envisions a day when all include that vision. He has a long history of public service. He previously headed the Community Relations Board, where he worked to keep peace, quell street violence, and advance the city's neighborhoods. He has been described as a thoughtful and streetwise advocate for Cleveland residents, and you have most recently led the neighborhood proud of 3 sons, an alum of Leadership Cleveland 2014, and just last night he was unanimously voted to have a seat on the Cleveland Leadership Center board, and we're happy to welcome you to that service, Blaine. Both of these gentlemen, along with Councilman Bashir Jones, sponsored the legislation declaring racism a public health crisis in Cleveland. And with that, I turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann, and thank you so much to all of you that are here today. And I also want to thank my colleague, Councilman Kerry McCormack, who's always been just such a thoughtful colleague and really help us be innovative and work as a unit to really address some of the most complex and vexing issues that this city have ever seen. So I appreciate his leadership on all of these different issues. We're here today to talk about racism being declared as a public health crisis. And I first want to state that this resolution was introduced on March the 2nd. It was introduced after 18 months of research, of 18 months of working closely with First Year Cleveland. I see Bernie Kerrigan on this call as well, and her and her team put a conference together on entire work we have never seen before. COVID-19, which is mass incarceration of 1.0 guidelines. As Councilman McCormack, one of my favorite movies is a movie called The Usual Suspects. And it's a guy in the movie called Kaiser Soze. And he says, the biggest trick the devil ever played on mankind is to convince the world that he didn't exist. That's what racism has done. So this city council has so those different systems impacted the African-American and minority community. More than 30 groups have joined us, from the Greater Cleveland Partnership to all of the philanthropic groups, to all of the major hospitals like Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Metro Health Hospitals. Everybody has joined with City Council to say we must do something about this horrible pandemic. So with that being said, on council, I cannot do this alone. I have to do this with partnership and with the body. And I want to say that even though Councilman McCormack was an early supporter and jumped on board with this resolution early, which I thought showed tremendous amount of courage, because some people think that it's just a Black issue. But the entire council, all 17 members of council, unanimously voted for this resolution. And now we're in the steps to really try to move this project forward and really try to make sustainable change in our community, because we cannot come out of this COVID-19 pandemic the same way that we came in it. With that, I'll introduce my colleague and he can take it.
Thank you, Councilman. And first of all, Marianne and Rachel and the entire Leadership Center team, thank you guys for your continued innovative and thoughtful work and really bringing people together around some of the most important conversations in our community. And for everyone that took time out today for lunch, hopefully I can't see all of you on screens, but hopefully some of you are having a sandwich or something on screen while we talk here. So no shame on that. It's a busy time in life. So again, I want to thank you all for having us here. Councilman Griffin is always, one of his best traits is that he's a humble person. But I'll just say that there is no way that we could have gotten through any of this work without his leadership. He runs our Health and Human Services Committee. He is tuned in to what's going on in the community. And I'll just tell you, if we're having a frank conversation here, There are some people who approach work for some motivations, and then there are other people that approach work with the good intentions of getting the work done. And what I love about Blaine is that he doesn't come to the table for self-gratification or to get his name out there. He comes to the table to get the work done. And you can always tell when those folks are in charge. So I just want to thank him for that. As Councilman Griffin indicated, I was one of the original 3 sponsors in March of the Declaration of Racism as a Public Health Crisis. And truly, to me, in addition to the action steps that will come through this declaration, to me, it's important that we look at all of the work that we do on a daily basis through the lens of systemic racism. So when we look back over the past year and a half in City Council in our community, when we've addressed lead paint poisoning, when we've talked about providing lawyers for people facing evictions, when we've talked about decriminalization of marijuana, when we've talked about supporting not-for-profits that provide mortgage lending in areas that have been traditionally and historically redlined, all of those issues, whether they be health-related or economically related, have a systemic racism has a huge impact on all of those. So it's important for us as a community to view these issues and other issues in our community through the lens of systemic racism. When we understand, identify, accept, and acknowledge the terrible impacts historically and into today to the present of systemic racism, then we can start to really understand the issues and what those solutions will be to address those. One quick example that always just floors me, Case Western Reserve University has a presentation on housing lending inequities right before the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. We're not talking about the 60s. We're not talking about, before that. Right before 2009, the average home value on the east side of the city of Cleveland was around $80,000. The average home value on the west side was around $86,000. And if you looked at the mortgage lending practices, a vast majority of these subprime mortgages, which had higher interest rates and higher mortgage payments, were targeted to the east side African American neighborhoods, even though 50% of those borrowers would have otherwise qualified for a prime mortgage with a lower interest rate and a lower payment, and a very smaller number were targeted on the west side neighborhoods of the city of Cleveland are predominantly more white neighborhoods. So that is an example of intentional systemic racism and how it targets things like economics and mortgage lending. It won't surprise you that through the financial crisis, there was a much larger foreclosure rate in the neighborhoods that were targeted with subprime mortgages than the neighborhoods that were targeted with prime mortgages. And now the average home value on the west side is about rebounded, and on the east side, it's just under $40,000. So that is a concrete, specific example of one of the many examples of how systemic racism plays its hand every day in our lives. Obviously, if we think of things like why is it that an African-American woman who has a master's degree is more likely to lose her child than a white woman without a high school degree? These are the conversations and the questions that we've been talking about in the community. But if we do not view them through the lens of systemic racism, then we're not serious about really fixing the root issues that are causing these problems. So I am really proud to be a part of this coalition. I think that it's important, quite frankly, for more people that look like me to be having these conversations, not just publicly, but in our living rooms, around the holiday tables, amongst our family members, not in the sense that wags our finger at our family member or that demeans them, but to say, look, these are conversations that we really need to have amongst each other in private spaces as well, not only so that we can mitigate the impact of systemic racism against our most acutely affected neighbors, but also because we know that when people don't do as well economically or from a health perspective or from a social emotional perspective, that brings our entire society down. So this is all of our problem. This is all of our fight. And I just want to quote Danielle Sidnor, who is the current president of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. She said, find your place in this work. Find your role, right? So we will all have different roles. It's important in this moment to really listen and elevate the voices of those who have not had that opportunity in the past, but we all have a role in this work. and this is all of our issue to solve together. There is no way when we talk about a more innovative Cleveland, a more connected Cleveland, when we talk about fresh leadership in Cleveland, when we talk about college retention and creating jobs and all these important issues in our community, if we don't start to meaningfully understand, view our issues through the lens of systemic racism, and then really work to address them, it's going to be a huge burden to any future success of our city.
Thank you. And, you know, my colleague, Councilman McCormack, summed it up. And the scenario he gave about housing, I think is spot on. I think that, you know, that's what we're talking about. Those are the things we're trying to address. Let me say this in closing, and we could just, we could go into the Q&A side, and because I really like to make sure we hear from all of the esteemed leaders here today. This is not easy. This is not feel-good work. This is not sexy. This is not the kind of stuff that at the end of the day is going to be comfortable. And I want to state that because we all come to the table with our own implicit bias. And notice I said we, not just one segment or the other. And there's going to have to be a lot of understanding, a lot of listening. But at the end of the day, that's what we're here to deal with as leaders across the board, not just city council, because this is not just a council issue. This is something we're going to engage the broader community. I do want to acknowledge that the NAACP, Urban League, YWCA, United Way, and First Year Cleveland all helped us pull and construct this, put this together so that we could be effective, because we strongly believe you have to have an internal and external partnership, and you have to involve leaders like yourself so that everybody, like my colleague Councilman McCormack is saying the same language, and people are starting to understand that we're one Cleveland as we have this discussion. So with that, Rachel and Marianne, we'll take any questions and go from there.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and insights on this such important piece of legislation and policy. So what is next? What happens next with the resolution?
Well, we had our first meeting this past week where we convened the initial sponsors of the resolution, as well as the external partners. And like I said, we're going to identify the kind of areas that we want to focus on, which right now it's about 5 or 6. I personally would like to whittle it down to 5. But then once we get those work groups together, then we're going to make a call to action. So for example, we got support from the hospitals, and they said that they want to be part of the solution. Well, we're going to find a way to get Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Metro Health, St. Vincent's Charities, the MCOs, medical care organizations, and others to the table to talk about best practices on how they're going to address American. Our department has to go back. We capture the data, and believe me, epidemiologists do this all the time. So, you know, we really are going to get those work groups together. And then we're going to have a very strict timeline where we're going to ask them to come back with recommendations for us at the city that we can legislate, so that we can have a package of ordinances that we can legislate in those 5 or 6 areas that I talked about. And then we're also going to ask the private community to be a part of it. As for example, we want the corporate community to put more diversity on their boards. So we're going to ask the corporate community and people like Business Volunteers Unlimited to really help us establishing a criteria for how we can actually make sure that we put more African Americans on some of these high profile boards. So this is just starting, like I said, and we'll find a way to make sure that we connect everybody to the process.
May I ask a question? All of what you two have proposed here, and nobody can disagree with it all. All of this problems emanated out of the Minnesota killing and the national concern about this. And the question I pose is, okay, you have a lot of Americans that want to do something. What can we as individuals do to help make it? It's good for the corporation to do this, hospitals do that, but what can Mary Q and John Q. Public do in some meaningful way to help in this cause?
Thank you for the question. And I would just say that, while the murder of George Floyd was definitely brought this to the attention of many Americans, our specific ordinance was introduced in March. And a lot of the work that we've been doing around lead paint poisoning and infant mortality and evictions and decriminalization, I'm sorry, I've got fireworks going on in the background. I apologize about that. It has all been going on, right? So this is not a new issue for a lot of folks in the community. Bruce, specifically to your question, I think that was Bruce. I could be wrong. I'm sorry. Is number one, we cannot pretend that laws and policy will solve systemic racism. We all have to work on the hearts and minds of our neighbors and family members. It's a very real, tangible point. So when we're in family gatherings, when we're at a business meeting, when we're in the community, talking about these issues, if we hear something that is racist, quite frankly, or that is really suspect, and really addressing it head on and helping to educate folks. We look at the LGBTQ movement, and a big reason that sentiment moved to supporting the LGBT movement was because folks and families started to come out and talk about their truths. So someone's brother, sister, aunt, uncle, neighbor came out, and then folks were able to see that this person is just like me, or this is the person I've loved for so long. So we have to work on hearts and minds, and that's not a quick bullet point short answer, but it's the truth. And so that's not something we'll be able to accomplish today, but it's the truth. The other thing I would say too is that getting involved in these initiatives that are going on, questioning the structures in which you are associated with, right? So the boards of the organizations you're on, when you buy products, who are you buying them from? What do their policies look like? So there's a lot of individual responsibility that we can look at when we talk about systemic racism in our community.
Bruce,
Blaine,
thanks.
I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, Bruce, thanks so much for that question. A couple of things that I would recommend. One is there's a brilliant group of folks called Third Space and Evelyn Burnett and Mordecai Cargill who do a great job around Racial Equity Institute. And I know that they have been funded to really do training. A lot of people have gone through the Race Equity Institute. There's some people that are already doing that kind of work that I would encourage you to be a part of again. I think my colleague summed it up earlier, just like quoting Danielle Sidnor's statement, find your space in this work. Bruce, I know for years, I know your work that you've dealt and had a passion with hunger insecurity. We want people to be a part of and focus where their passion is and focus on systemic change on the areas that they affect. So I would tell you that, you also, when you're having conversations, don't just talk about the societal cause of racism. A lot of people talk about the social and the psychological impediments of racism. Racism also costs money. Racism, because of these different disparities, whenever a certain group falls behind, and let's use health disparities once again. If they don't have a primary care doctor, then they're going to go to the emergency room. And that money and that bill gets spread out amongst all of the people who are paying for healthcare. And those are the kind of things that you need to let people know, that when you do have racism and when you do have the social constructs, that some kind of way that there's a cost that everybody has a role that everybody's going to pay into. So they may not think so, but there's a cost in racism. Even if you look at just the loss of production. If you have so many people that are held back that cannot participate in the economy like they would like to, that's a big issue. So I would tell you that individually, find your space in this work, the passion, concrete step, do REI and get involved in something like that. And then last but not least, just make sure that you're having those coffee table conversations with your friends and family to let people know why it's important to address racism, not just from a societal standpoint that's basically making America bust at our seams and manifested in the civil unrest that we seen a couple of weeks ago, but also the financial impact that it has on our whole society, not just a specific group.
Hey, and one other thing I want to add in there before we jump to the next question, introspection. So there's a lot of good readings out there. White Fragility is one of the books that's coming highly recommended, but educating ourselves, we all have biases, we all grew up in certain environments, but educating yourself on our own biases, I think is really important.
So some questions coming in. We know that these issues don't stop at the Cleveland borders. So as we look to the county, as we look to our region, what else might be happening around these issues and in this space?
I think that the county, well, my good friend, and I was on the call with her this morning, Chairwoman Chantel Brown, the county is actually about to introduce a racism ordinance as well. So the state has introduced a resolution at the state level. Other cities have introduced it. I've been contacted by no shortage of 5 to 6 different cities in Ohio and outside of Ohio that want to follow the lead of this. So I think you're going to hear this more universally, that everybody recognize that we have to take, let me say this, a lot of people have been doing work in this space for a long time. So racism is nothing new. But what we're really trying to do is that we're trying to take a fresh look at it. We're trying to make sure that we look at what policies need to be enhanced. So just to let you know, I think the county is going to come on board with this as well. And you're right, though they're going to have some of the same issues. However, our ordinance and our work group is going to focus on the city. And if I could be of any help, because I am a county resident too, then I'll help my good friend Chantel Brown, who's going to lead that initiative.
Another thing I would note too is that looking regionally and look at some of the patterns and trends that we've seen over the last 50 years and asking the question, why did those happen? Introspection doesn't stop at the city borders. The other thing I would, in schools, right? When we say a good school district, what are we talking about? What are the undertones in that comment? So there are all these examples as a region in the language we use and the patterns we've seen that we should have a conversation about in the lens of systemic racism.
And just let me say this too. You hear a lot of conversation about unigov and regional government, and I think that we definitely need to look at some restructuring of how a 21st century government operates. And I'm a big fan of us looking at that. But what we often are presented with in the city of Cleveland is that people, I'm a cowboy movie fan, so excuse me for telling things in the story. People, and if you're a good cowboy movie fan, what are the 2 things that most people come that they want? They want the water and they want the railroad. Well, now it's the same thing. Most people want to come and they want to talk about regionalism, and they talk about Cleveland. We want to have access to your assets, which is water and the airports. But what they don't talk about are schools and safety and police forces and those things that I think, are critical to us moving forward. So I guess what I'm saying to you is, if we're going to be forced into having a conversation about unigovernment and regional government, then we're going to honestly have to address some of the racial, things that we're going to have to overcome before we even get to that point as well.